Okay, so now we want to talk a little bit about critical medical anthropology, which is an approach to medical anthropology that has been influential for me, and maybe in particular one practitioner of this approach named Paul Farmer, who we've mentioned before and who we're going to read again later in this course when we read the second book called AIDS and Accusation. So critical medical anthropology has a particular conceptual framing or a particular kind of approach which we can refer to, or I think it helps to explain, in terms of this metaphor of thinking upstream. So what does it mean to think upstream? So some people within this tradition have talked about this idea of rescuing bodies that are floating down a river, and an individual, let's say us, or a public health practitioner, is on the bank seeing these bodies float down, and first you see one and you run in, you rescue the body and you take it out and you're trying to do CPR, and then you see another body, and so you have to leave the first one and you go and take that body and you try to rescue that second body. Soon you notice that there's a whole lot of bodies floating down the river and that you simply can't rescue all of those individuals, and so you ask the question, which is the critical question for this approach: what's going on upstream? What is happening up the river that is producing the scenario in which all of these bodies are floating down in need of being rescued? So this metaphor is used to sort of ask the critical question of what are the larger factors that might be invisible to us when we look at an individual on the ground, an individual who might be suffering from some kind of illness. What is it that is actually structuring those kinds of outcomes that we don't necessarily see when we look at it in a myopic kind of framework, within a lens that is just too close to the individual case, but not actually looking upstream at the factors that might be affecting the conditions in which that individual is living, and how that might be related to this suffering. So one of the assumptions of this upstream approach is that micro-level approaches and theories are seen to actually contribute to this problem, to contribute to the problem of really understanding what's happening in many scenarios in the world with health disparities in particular, that micro-level approaches actually obfuscate, or they tend to erase or not help us to think about what these large structural factors are that are really shaping health and disease in many cases. So what do we mean by micro-level approaches? So a micro-level approach might be something that is a public health message that is trying to get people to behave in some specific way differently as individuals. So use a condom to prevent HIV or to prevent STIs would be one obvious approach. These educational messages about using a seatbelt, for example, making the decision to use a seatbelt when you get in the car. These are micro-level individual behaviors that are usually the target of much of the standard public health that is done globally. So what these approaches are inviting us to say is, what is there beyond thinking about a condom, for example, that is structuring who is getting HIV and who is suffering most under this condition or this global epidemic in that particular case, more than just these individual behavioral decisions or choices or actions that people are making at the micro level. So these contrasts between the micro level and the macro level are important to think through critically, and I think these folks, these medical anthropologists, are inviting us to think as macro as we can. So what are the large-scale systems that are creating conditions, usually of inequality is what we're mostly focusing on, of social inequalities, of structural inequalities, that contribute then to differences, vast population level differences in health conditions And that's really what's sort of guiding a lot of what is happening with the epidemiology of various conditions around the world. And you really have to be able to think that way to be a practitioner of CMA, of critical medical anthropology. You have to be able to think in an upstream fashion. So critical medical anthropology emerged as an approach within medical anthropology in the 1970s. It was partly influenced by some of the post-Vietnam War kinds of critiques about the social conditions in which many people, especially outside of the West, were living, and some of those post-colonial critiques also of colonization that were emerging at the same time. So it's informed in part by what we would refer to as neo-Marxist approaches. So this doesn't mean anything in terms of political affiliation. What it means is that it derives from approaches that are similar to Karl Marx and his principles, which emphasized issues of social and class inequality in society as large-scale influences on the well-being of populations, and particularly of the poor. And so CMA is exemplified, following on this kind of tradition of neo-Marxist approaches, is exemplified by a number of big names within medical anthropology. So if you're interested in exploring more on this topic, here's a few names. I already mentioned Paul Farmer. Nancy Shepard-Hughes is an anthropologist at UC Berkeley. Meryl Singer is well known for writing some of the foundational texts on critical medical anthropology. Hans Baer, Philippe Bourgois, and Brooke Sheff are some other examples there. So quickly, why don't we go through some of the main tenets of what critical medical anthropology is, some of the theoretical assumptions behind it, and I'll try to summarize those, and these complement the readings that you have for this week that I think describe the approach well, so make sure that you're keeping up on your reading as well. So one basic theoretical assumption of critical medical anthropology is that it tends to emphasize examining the linkage between knowledge and power. So that sounds like a mouthful, I suppose, and it is difficult to summarize all of the literature that is kind of backing up this particular type of approach, but essentially it has these elements that I'm going to describe. So it asks questions like, whose interests are being served by ways of talking about health and disease? So it asks critical questions about how do we tend to discuss in terms of what are facts about health and illness? How do those actually tend to produce particular power differences in society, or how do they actually feed into, for example, the profits of particular kinds of pharmaceutical industries would be an example. So how is it that the ways that we narrate or think about disease categories and illness events, how do those things feed into then power differences in society? It follows on some of the important work by people like Michel Foucault, which is a philosopher who talks about how knowledge is political and always serves power and domination. So in his terms and his type of approach, terms and pathologies are viewed as exerting power through scientific knowledge. So science becomes kind of the enemy here. Science produces some of the categories that actually can oppress people or can regulate people or can discipline people, in the words of Michel Foucault. And so one example of that would be a useful historical example is how before we had the category of HIV/AIDS, some of you may be aware that the original term that was used to describe HIV/AIDS was gay-related immune deficiency. And so what actually ended up happening as a result of that label at the beginning was that a lot of people within the LGBT community were highly, highly stigmatized and marginalized as a result of the association between HIV/AIDS and the gay community as an automatic kind of association that people made, which tended to feed into existing stigma and discrimination against that community. But the other problem was that, which was a global problem, was that a lot of people who were not LGBT identified, so they might identify as heterosexual, around the world believed that they could not get HIV. And so it became a global problem to re-educate people on the fact that yes, heterosexual people can get HIV, and in fact, outside of the US at that time, in a lot of parts of the world, it was primarily heterosexually transmitted. So it was a real problem in the labeling and the way that knowledge was produced about HIV/AIDS at the beginning that emphasized this gay-related immune deficiency. And then Foucault, people like Foucault would say, well, that's one way in which these categories exert power and promote inequalities in society. This is a kind of approach that medical anthropologists within this tradition of critical medical anthropology would tend to take as well. So then even things like diagnosis and cure can be subject to suspicion within this approach. And so these medical anthropologists that take this kind of tack are actually very suspicious of the ways that categories are used to create docile bodies that can be manipulated, controlled, or commodified by industry. So you can see here that this is a critical approach to all medical categories, but maybe in particular to the ways that biomedicine in the West tends to categorize and regulate and subjugate people.